and welcome to Global News Today, bringing you exclusive interviews with leading experts every weekday here on Arabiya English. I'm Tom Burgess-Watson. Coming up on today's program, the Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky expresses gratitude for the US President Donald Trump's plan to send more weapons to Ukraine, in particular, Patriot air defense missile systems. Coming up, we ask, why the apparent change of heart from the Trump administration? And is this the end of the road for Washington's diplomatic engagement with Moscow in the bid to try and end the war in Ukraine? Hello and welcome. Today we're going to focus on the war in Ukraine. Now, when President Donald Trump took office back in January, he pledged to find a diplomatic solution to this conflict. That approach appears to be shifting. Well, President Trump is rolling out a new plan to pressure Russia with two key new moves. One is to sell weapons to European allies who will then transfer them on to Ukraine. Two, hit Russia's trading partners with tariffs. This in an effort to further isolate Moscow. Well, President Trump also issued a warning to his Russian counterpart, President Vladimir Putin: reach a peace deal in 50 days from now or face 100% tariffs.
It's not my war. I'm trying to get you out of it. And we want to see it end. And I'm disappointed in President Putin because I thought we would have had a deal 2 months ago, but it doesn't seem to get there. So based on that, we're going to be doing secondary tariffs if we don't have a deal in 50 days. It's very simple. And they'll be at 100%.
Well, for more on this, we can cross now to John Herbst, who's a former US Ambassador to Ukraine. Thank you very much indeed for taking the time to speak to us. I mean, just looking at, the way things have gone these last few months and President Trump's diplomatic overtures to Moscow, it doesn't seem like Moscow's been at all receptive to any of them. Do you think President Trump's been wasting his time?
I felt all along that Putin was not interested in peace. He wants to subjugate Ukraine, and since Ukraine will not surrender, he wants to continue the war. President Trump gave Putin the benefit of the doubt. Already, President Trump entered office in late January. Already by April, even supporters of his, the editorial writers at the New York Post or the Wall Street Journal, were pointing out that Putin was playing Trump, and they were right. But it took President Trump a little bit more time to see that. But he has seen it. And I think what he did yesterday was very strong, very good.
Yeah, and all the while, President Trump's been trying to broker a ceasefire. Russia's been launching really record numbers of drones and missiles at Ukraine these last few months. I mean, what message is Moscow sending Washington?
Complete disregard of the United States' position and President Trump himself. It's really quite remarkable. I thought Putin would be a little bit smarter than that. But the fact that, right after several phone calls, not just the last one, Russia sent even more drones and even more missiles into Ukraine was demonstrating that President Trump was achieving nothing in his calls. And finally, President Trump got mad. It's also worth noting that, before, in 2018, when then Syrian dictator Assad was threatening to use chemical weapons on his civilians, Trump warned him not to do it. And Assad did use CW, and Trump took out a good portion of Syria's Air Force because he was personally appalled by the suffering of the Syrian civilians. The Russians should have remembered that before they began to amp up their strikes on not just civilians per se in Ukraine, but maternity wards, hospitals, schools, etc.
So I think you've basically answered my next question, which is, why the U-turn by President Trump? Why has he now decided that giving Patriot missiles to Ukraine is the right course of action? I mean, it sounds very much along the lines of what you were just saying now.
I would not overstate the Patriot dimension of this because we have provided Patriots. We've been part of a process providing Patriots to Ukraine before. But it's the strong condemnation of what Putin is doing, the questioning of his motivation, the first time now that this new president, or second-time president, in this term, is talking about sending billions of dollars worth of weapons, including, as he himself said, top-of-the-line weapons. And while Trump himself only mentioned Patriots, Secretary General Rutte, who was meeting with Trump at that time, referred to missiles as well. In other words, offensive weapons. And you undoubtedly saw the story in the Financial Times overnight that Trump asked Zelensky, could he strike Moscow or Petersburg? And Zelensky said yes, with American weapons.
I mean, this is all quite risky for President Trump politically, and I'm talking about from a domestic perspective. There are quite a lot of people in the president's support base, the MAGA group, who feel a bit betrayed by this decision. I'm just wondering how audible they are and how much of a threat you think they pose to President Trump domestically.
I follow this very closely. I think what you just stated is a quote-unquote urban legend and not quite accurate. You're right that as a candidate, Trump talked about in a way that suggested minimalizing American engagement abroad, especially military engagement. And a lot of his most prominent supporters bought into that. And people with real influence and access with Trump held those views. I'm thinking of Tucker Carlson. I'm thinking of Elon Musk. But also within the administration, Tulsi Gabbard, and maybe even Secretary of Defense Hegseth, and certainly with regard to anything except China, Under Secretary of Defense Colby. But look what's happened to those voices. Trump made the smart decision last month to use America's famous bunker buster bombs following Israel's successful strike on Ukrainian nuclear facilities to finish the job off. Tucker Carlson criticized Trump explicitly. We heard their newspaper reporting that Gabbard and Hegseth weren't too enthusiastic about this. Trump slammed Carlson, who then healed too. And we didn't hear much from Gabbard or Hegseth after that. So Trump demonstrated that he can do something which quote-unquote MAGA world might not like, and I won't just say get away with it, but establish that he's the guy who determines MAGA world's foreign policy. It's quite interesting that you had some serious pushback regarding Iran, but really none when Trump overrode the foolish decision by the Pentagon to pause defensive arms to Ukraine, and then when Trump made this very dramatic announcement yesterday. We're not hearing those voices we heard before. So Trump really makes these decisions, and he has very little vulnerability with his base on these decisions.
Yeah, the people I was thinking of were, in fact, people like Marjorie Taylor Greene and Steve Bannon, who are very much of the opinion this isn't an American problem. This is a European problem, they say. Let Europe deal with it. That seems to be their argument, and that's what we've been hearing. And President Trump not seeing it that way anymore.
I think that they are marginal figures when it comes to foreign policy. I mean, Bannon's been on the outs with Trump since the first term. And if you recall, Trump gave a more or less green light to the American aid package for Ukraine April of last year. And Marjorie Taylor Greene was fulminating against that. As for that matter, and this is ironic, then Senator Vance. And Trump told MTG to calm down. You know, you're a nice lady, but I make the decisions here, man. So I don't see that as very significant. Again, I think that Trump determines these things. We haven't heard much criticism of Trump's very bold announcement yesterday. And again, that demonstrates he's got control of his own movement.
Some critics of President Trump, including outside the United States, say, you know, on the face of it, what we've seen these last 6 months is something of an erratic policy towards Ukraine. Should we support Ukraine? Should we not support Ukraine? Attempts to engage with President Putin. Underneath all of that, though, Ambassador, do you see a strategy as having been president all the while?
I can't be certain of that. Many of my colleagues felt that when Trump won the election last November, he was going to wind up essentially selling out Ukraine to the Kremlin. I always thought that was wrong because Doing that would be a demonstration of profound weakness. And Trump is not a weak man, and he certainly doesn't conceive of himself as a weak man. But he wanted to get along with Putin. That is very clear. He set, I would say, a fatuous goal back in February or early March of a reset with Russia, the very bad Obama bad idea, which didn't work then. And he, through his pal Witkoff, tried to make that happen. But Trump was not, Trump understood, even as he was seeking better relations with Moscow, that if for better relations with Moscow, he had to let Putin do what he wanted in Ukraine. That was a very bad bargain, not least for Trump's own reputation.
Just lastly,
that's what we've seen happen.
Okay, so to sum up, I mean, these last 6 months, and it's obviously a very difficult nut to crack for all presidents, including President Trump's predecessor. I mean, has anything been achieved these last 6 months? Because from where I sit, I haven't seen a single concession from the Russian side.
Okay. First, Trump achieved a lot with Iran. And that kind of set the stage for the very clear policy direction he's moved in since that time. And no, Putin has not offered any concessions, and that's exactly the point. And again, many of my colleagues in the analytical community understood that Putin was not going to offer any concessions. Most of them felt, as I already mentioned, that Trump was going to go along with that. There were a few who, with me, my colleagues, Dan Fried, Bill Taylor, understood that, Trump could go that way, but it would not turn out well for him if he did. And for that reason, we held the hope that this could turn out right. But we always expected that Putin would make it hard for Trump to hand over Ukraine by refusing to make any real concessions. And that's probably the principal reason why we've seen Trump stake out this firm, this Reagan-esque peace through strength position, which is what his announcement yesterday was.
Okay, we're going to have to leave it there. Thank you very much indeed for your time. Really appreciate it. Always a pleasure talking to you. John Herbst, former US Ambassador to Ukraine. Thank you, Ambassador. Well, let's get more analysis on this now. We can cross to Moscow and speak to Sergei Markov, who is a former spokesperson to the Russian President Vladimir Putin. Thank you very much indeed for taking the time to speak to us, Mr. Markov. We've heard from President Trump. He set this 50-day deadline for a peace deal in Ukraine. How does Russia respond to that?
Russia will ignore this ultimatum. First of all, Russia denied any ultimatum to each during last something about 400 years. And Russia will do the same here, first. Secondly, now we could see that Reuters published some leaks from Kremlin. I think it's very good. Leaks that Vladimir Putin strongly believed that it was no real talks between Russia and Western countries and between Russia and Ukraine or the peace deal. No peace talk at all. Even Witkoff, one of the most reasonable envoys of Donald Trump, he didn't come to the real negotiation about real conditions of the peace. So the problem is Donald Trump ignored real problems. Real problems is, first of all, that Ukraine is not democratic regime. It's a very repressive regime. Another problem that Western countries making anti-Russia from Ukraine by terror doing this. And Russia will have to suppress this anti-Russia. Russia agree with independent democratic Ukraine, but Russia fully disagree with repressive anti-Russia on its small borders. So this, if Donald Trump wants to discuss peace deal, okay, we welcome. If Donald Trump decided to give ultimatum to Russia, just go to hell.
Okay. Has anything been achieved these last 6 months, do you think, Mr. Markov?
Last 6 months, it was continue of the war and Russian army taking not so much territories. Of course, Russia army taking every village on the Donbass region, Russian Donbass region. But its territory not so important. More important that Russia making military pressure to Ukraine, and you may know that now Ukrainians doesn't want to fight, and it's some kind of resistance to the mass violence mobilization. And every day we can see the video about barbaric, violent mobilization of Ukrainian male on the streets of Ukraine. So Russia not so much interesting to take territories. Russia interesting as a crushing of Ukrainian army, crashing of Ukrainian regime, and then starting of real negotiation. Real negotiation didn't happen during these 6 months as yet because Western countries has no political will to discuss real reasons of the peace.
What do you think about President Trump's decision to make a U-turn and provide additional Patriot missile batteries to Ukraine? What's your interpretation of that?
I think Donald Trump, there are two options. One, that Donald Trump decided to follow Joe Biden policy, and that's why he's going to support Ukrainian regime and its war. It's one possibility. Another possibility, which I think more realistic, that Donald Trump wants to give some kind of piece of military support to Ukrainian regime to avoid some kind of criticism, but then he wants to close this page of peace negotiation. Donald Trump wanted to have peace deal also between Russia and Ukraine, also for the getting Nobel Peace Prize. Now he understands there are no chance for this. And he probably will distance himself and distance United States from this Ukrainian war.
Do you think it's fair to say, and some people say this sometimes, that President Putin doesn't believe that Ukraine should exist as an independent state? Is that a fair view of how Mr. Putin views Ukraine?
No, it's absolutely wrong, and this is absolutely a lie. Vladimir Putin was agree with democratic, independent Ukraine, which would be neutral and friendly to Russia, and we have cooperation. And it happened during 15 years before the neo-Nazi military coup of 2014. Vladimir Putin again fully agree with democratic, independent country, Ukraine. But Ukraine now not democratic and not independent. Ukraine now under the dictatorship of the Western countries, with making anti-Russia from poor Ukrainian people. And so if Western countries will continue to do this, Russia will have to crush this regime and will take some of the territories of Ukraine with millions of the Ukrainian people who is Russians by ethnicity to the Russian Federation.
Some people sometimes tell us that the Russian economy is starting to suffer. President Trump has threatened new sanctions against Russia. Can the Russian economy sustain further sanctions, do you think?
I think those who is talking about this even doesn't trust themselves. Look, it's very simple figures. Economic growth of European Union during these couple of years, 1% or possibly less than 1%. And in the leading economy like Germany, it's zero, in fact. It's a depression. Economic growth of United States, 2.5%. Economic growth is Russia, 3.5%. So economic growth in Russia bigger than in United States and Europe together. So Russian economy in good conditions. And you know, most of the world support Russia indirectly, unpublicly, but nobody like such absolutely imperialist, brutal policy which Western countries conducted for poor Ukrainian people.
But even ministers in the Russian government are saying that Russia is headed towards potentially a recession. Do you admit that the economy is struggling, though?
Oh, Russia has inflation. Inflation. It's first of all because big military spendings, and now Russian central bank tried to suppress inflation by giving less money to economy. As a result, economic growth is becoming less. But nevertheless, even with problems with Russian economy will be in better condition than European economy.
Okay. I mean, that's the economy. I just want to go back to talking about President Trump. I mean, what do you think President Putin and people at the top end of the leadership in Russia think of President Trump? What's their opinion of him as a person and as a statesman?
I'm sure, I know for sure that Vladimir Putin very much respect Donald Trump as in fact political hero who tried to struggle for interests of American people against deep state and oligarchy and global liberals who dominated in US policy during previous years. And everybody could see behavior of Donald Trump during attempt to kill him during election campaign. And Vladimir Putin trusts Donald Trump, then Donald Trump really want to stop war in Ukraine. But same time, Russian leaders doesn't think that Donald Trump has such power as, for example, Russian president and Chinese president has, and even French president Macron or Ukrainian president Zelensky now has better power than Donald Trump inside country, because deep state is the main enemy of Donald Trump. And as a result, US policy, it's not policy of Donald Trump. It's some kind of complicated combination of Donald Trump and deep state. And so Trump wants to have peace in Ukraine. And Putin wants to help Trump to come to the peace to Ukraine. But if Donald Trump not strong enough, if Donald Trump weak to fight against deep state, what we can do? Vladimir Putin cannot crush deep state of United States of America.
Just lastly then,
it's Donald Trump's job.
Why do you think President Trump is therefore saying he's disappointed with President Putin? What's behind that?
It's very easily. Donald Trump wants to get a Nobel Peace Prize because of the stopping Ukrainian war. And Donald Trump has no power enough to suppress real engine of the war, meaning Vladimir Zelensky and European leaders. He was too weak to fight against them politically on this scheme. As a result, Donald Trump decided, okay, I will ask Vladimir Putin to have a ceasefire. But how Russia can go to ceasefire if leaders of Great Britain and France directly told that if ceasefire happens, next day they will send 50,000 troops to Ukrainian territory and to send very many of the new weaponry. That's why Russia denied Donald Trump's suggestion to have ceasefire just for the Donald Trump Nobel Peace Prize. That's why he is disappointed. But more realistically, Donald Trump should understand Putin is friend of Donald Trump. Zelensky is enemy of Donald Trump. So if you, Donald Trump, real president, crash Zelensky, and peace will come.
Okay, well, we're going to have to leave it there. Thank you very much for your time. Appreciate you speaking to us. Sergei Markov,
my pleasure.
Former spokesperson for the Russian president. Thank you very much indeed. Well, sitting alongside President Trump in the Oval Office, the NATO Secretary General Mark Rutte yesterday praised the latest plan to sell US arms to allies like Germany, Finland and Denmark, who in turn are going to send them to Ukraine. Well, both President Trump and Rutte voiced growing frustration with the Russian President Vladimir Putin, saying that more people, including Russian troops, are dying every day because of this war. Let's take a listen.
I felt, I don't know about you, Mark, but I felt that we had a deal about 4 times. Mm-hmm. And here we are, still talking about...
And he didn't send serious people to the negotiations. So I remember that you were able, with Marco Rubio and with Steve Witkoff, to get these talks going in Istanbul. But then the Russians came up with this historian, explaining history of Russia since 1250.
We should have had a deal done a long time ago. Every night people are dying. A lot of people, a lot of Russian soldiers are dying, by the way. And a lot of Ukrainian soldiers too. But a lot of Russian soldiers are dying.
100,000 Russian soldiers since 1st of January. Since January. 100,000 Russian soldiers dead since January. So if anybody in Moscow is listening to this, again, 100,000 dead Russians since January.
Let's get more on this now, and we can speak to Rear Admiral Dr. Chris Parry, who's a former NATO commander. Thank you very much indeed for joining us once again here on Arabiya English. I mean, just listening to what President Trump's been saying the last few days and the decisions he's been taking, all of this suggests a rather different approach to the war in Ukraine compared to a few months ago. I don't know if you agree with that, but if so, why do you think that is?
I think in the past, what President Trump has done is tried to say to President Putin, look, you know, we want an end to this war. I don't know whether you do or not, but we do, certainly in Europe and in America, and certainly Ukraine needs to. One thing I've been struck by is how basically offended President Trump has been by the destruction going on in Ukraine at the moment. He keeps repeating that. So he's keen to stop the death and destruction. Where I think it's changed is that President Trump thought that he would give President Putin a chance to come to the negotiating table. He gave him all sorts of incentives. He sort of praised him. He sort of said, well, it's not totally the Russians' fault. We recognize this, Tom, frankly, because this is classic sort of Trump play. If you read The Art of the Deal, he attracts you with his left hand. He'll outrage you with it. He'll say all sorts of things. And while you're concentrating on that, he'll do something with his right hand. And that's what we saw in the bombing of the Iranian nuclear sites. So I think we're playing a long strategy here. He's tried to bait the hook with President Putin. That hasn't worked. And so he's saying, well, fine, we're going to put sanctions on you, probably even tariffs on your trading partners. And also we're going to supply more weapons to Ukraine. See how you like that.
So what you're saying is what looks like, you know, on the outset as being, you know, an erratic strategy or perhaps lack of strategy was in fact a strategy in itself.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's entirely consistent with what happened during his first term. Certainly, I was saying to a number of outlets, you know, just watch, this is going to change. This is going to flip soon if President Putin doesn't actually reciprocate and come to the negotiating table.
We've heard President Trump saying that they're going to deploy extra Patriot surface-to-air missile batteries to Ukraine. Not for free, I should add. But why is that type of weaponry so important, do you think?
If you look at the weight of drone and missile attack that's taking place on a daily basis now, you'll see the need for very extensive anti-ballistic, anti-cruise and anti-drone weapon systems. Give you some idea, on the 4th of July, the Russians launched nearly 540 Iranian-made drones against Ukrainian targets. They also backed it up with 11 cruise and ballistic missiles. On the 9th of July, they fired 741 long-range drones, again made in Iran, and 13 cruise and ballistic missiles. The prospect is that this is going to continue for some time. And I suspect by the autumn, we're going to see salvo sizes of about 1,000 drones and missiles every day. If you look at the way that Russian production is ramping up at the moment itself, they're soon going to be producing 500 long-range drones a day. They're going to be getting others from China and Iran. And if that bombardment continues, life is not going to be worth living in terms of the destruction of infrastructure and urban buildings and things like that in Ukraine.
Oh, and what do you think of the idea that those weapons will be paid for by NATO allies?
Yes, what we've seen with President Trump saying, I'm going to be very generous with some of the weapons that I'm going to send you, but I expect my European partners to pay for that. Now, there's a slight problem coming up on the horizon. The 50 billion loan and 300 million interest guarantee that have been forwarded to Ukraine by the US and also by the Europeans runs out at the end of 2025. And on top of any armaments, the Europeans are going to have to put together nearly $19 billion worth of aid for Ukraine. And they're scratching around right now trying to find out how they can deliver that.
Those extra weapons obviously going to make a huge difference, aren't they, to Ukraine's chances here?
Well, it'll enable them not to lose the war. I think that's the critical thing. I don't see any way in which Ukraine can actually recapture the territory that it's lost. What it can do is stop Russia actually proceeding any further along a very broad front. I mean, in the last month, the only sort of land that Russia's been able to capture back or even capture from the Ukrainians has been about 190 square miles. Now, that's about twice the size of Ajman in the UAE. So it's not very much at all. And so the whole Russian war machine has only been able to capture that much territory. So they're grinding to a sort of real stalemate along this very long front. And what I think President Trump is hoping and President Putin is fearing is that it will lock in that sort of front, if you like, just at the point when President Trump puts these very punitive sanctions up to 100%. On quite a lot of countries that are trading with Russia still, and maybe even 500% is what he's talking about if these people really misbehave.
So obviously diplomatic efforts by President Trump, we've agreed, haven't really delivered perhaps what he might have hoped. He said he's disappointed himself. Could we be looking here at escalation? I mean, military escalation and perhaps more parties getting actively engaged in this war?
I think there are a number of possibilities here. If we are thinking about the United States or indeed NATO protecting Ukraine, then the first thing we're going to see is no-fly zones over Ukraine, probably bases in Poland, Germany, other NATO countries that sort of border the Black Sea as well. So that would be the first sign that it's starting to move towards a protective sort of strategy. We're also hearing that China says that it will support Russia whatever happens. It wants to go for deeper support. So you can imagine that there'll be a lot of armaments and components coming from China to help. You'll probably see Chinese ships arriving somewhere in the Eastern Mediterranean as part of that. And if we're going to contain that sort of escalation, there has to be some way of actually getting to the negotiating tables. Otherwise, we're going to have this all-out, it's like two boxers slogging each other. Eventually, they're going to sort of realize that landing blows on each other is going to hurt their populations. And I think the real change in the Ukraine war will come if the Ukrainians are able to leverage some of the weaponry that they're getting to the United States and from Europe to really hurt the Russians. And I think that lay at the heart of the discussion which may or may not have taken place between Zelensky and Trump with regarding can the Ukrainians hit Moscow. That, to me, is a hint that maybe Ukraine is pushing the United States for weapons that enable it to actually hit much further than the current range at which they are. So between 300 and 500 miles range, something like that.
We had a guest yesterday who said, you know, the best way forward here for the United States and for Ukraine's other allies was to strengthen the Ukrainian position as much as possible and to go after the Russian economy. Do you subscribe to that?
Oh, I think that's the plan, to tell you the truth. As long as you can stabilize the front and stop the Ukrainians suffering too much from this very heavy bombardment that they're taking against their cities and against their infrastructure, I think Russia's economy is very close to being in crisis. And by crisis, I mean starting to hit people on the streets. To be perfectly frank, if President Trump imposes secondary sanctions on China, India, and these others who buy Russian oil, and somehow he's able to depress the price of oil, and of course this affects everybody in the Gulf region as well, depress the oil price for a certain period, then Russia can't sustain the war. There's no question about that without collapsing its economy completely.
All right. Well, thank you very much, and we're going to leave it there. Thank you for your analysis, Rear Admiral Dr. Chris Parry, former NATO commander. Thank you for your time. Well, as we stay focused on the war in Ukraine, let's turn now to our next guest, Sir Michael Fallon, former UK Defence Secretary. Sir Michael, you were, of course, Defence Secretary at the time of the first invasion of Ukrainian territory, Crimea, by the Russians. I just want to start by asking you what you read into the fact that President Trump is sounding rather different in his approach to the war in Ukraine compared to a few months ago, and whether you think perhaps that's generating a few sighs of relief in London and other Western capitals.
Well, certainly he's now sounding much more realistic. Ending wars like this, there was talk of ending it in a day or sorting it out within a month. Ending a terrible conflict like this, is going to take time. We know that from the amount of time it took to end the Vietnam War or the Korean War. So it was never going to be something that could be done overnight. And I'm delighted to see the White House now recognises that. Secondly, I think it reflects a much harder line against Moscow. I suspect President Trump started off by thinking he could simply do a deal with Putin. And he's now learning, as we've all learned, that Putin, A, doesn't stick to his word, and B, is absolutely determined to go on fighting this war and killing civilians and bombing Ukraine for as long as he can get away with. So, for that respect, it's a much more realistic approach from Washington. And I think there will be relief here. I think, Britain and France, Russia, Britain, France, Washington, and indeed Ukraine are all coming closer together now about what has to be done to push Putin to the negotiating table and to bring about the kind of ceasefire that we all want to see.
And what do you read into the change of heart with regards to Patriot missile systems, and how much of a difference do you think they're going to make to Ukraine?
Well, Putin, I think, has overplayed his hands. He's continued and increased the bombardment of Ukrainian cities, and he's been killing a lot of civilians quite indiscriminately, not hitting military targets, but bombing apartment blocks and hospitals and children's nurseries and the rest of it. And I think that has certainly shifted the mood in Washington, that this kind of slaughter can't be allowed to go on. And that's what's driving now, I think, a coalition, really, between Europe and the United States, that we've now got to get Putin to end this war. And you notice behind the president's statement now lies the very serious threat of much bigger sanctions involving, total embargo on any companies involved on the American side in any kind of supply to Russia, and that could involve China and India as well, and also the possibility that many more weapons can be sent on top of the Patriot missiles that he's now going to send.
Patriot missiles that will be paid for by NATO member states, particularly European member states. Do you think that's fair?
Yes, the money is not really the problem here. These things are very, very expensive, but NATO countries are fully prepared now to help Ukraine. You've seen countries like very small countries like Norway already stepping forward and offering to pay. And I think now there will be a rallying round across Europe, and they will find the money. What has been the problem up to now has been the shortage of these particular missile systems, and the fact the United States has needed all of those to guard bases in the Middle East and elsewhere. So it's very good news that some are now going to be released, and Europe will find the money to pay for them.
And do you think that will perhaps dispel this theory amongst some people, particularly in the MAGA base, that the Europeans haven't been paying their share in this war?
Well, you saw at the Hague summit recently, the NATO countries come together and agree with the United States that they should now, in total, be spending over 5% That's 3.5% straight away and another 1.5% on associated defence spending. So that is matching what the Americans are already spending and what some countries in Europe are already going to spend, like Poland and the Baltic states. So the argument about Europe paying its fair share, I think Trump has won that now. He's got this commitment. Okay, it's spread over a few years and some European countries will have to follow through. But, Trump should never have been underestimated. He's beginning to win that argument. And that means, that, yes, we will have to pick up the bill. But, of course, half of all the aid that's gone to Ukraine hasn't come from Europe. It's come from the United States. So, it's very welcome that that commitment is being restored. And I think personally that this change in approach from Washington is actually likely now to bring peace closer.
Do you think the efforts to bring about a ceasefire were essentially a waste of time, Sir Michael?
I think the Americans tried to get Putin to the table, and he came to the table. He sent his officials to the table, but clearly the demands they were making from the Russian side were never changed. They wanted full control over a large chunk of Ukraine, and they wanted Ukraine to lay down its weapons and not have an army in the future. That simply wouldn't be acceptable, given that Russia has already invaded Ukraine 3 years ago and invaded 8 years ago. So the Russians, weren't serious about negotiating. Now they face the prospect of much more serious international sanctions, and indeed the coalition, France and Britain and indeed the United States, are now looking again at those frozen Russian assets to see how some of that money can be released now to help restore Ukraine once any ceasefires are agreed. So, Russia now will have to reconsider its position, and we'll see in the next few days and weeks whether they are prepared now to negotiate some sort of peace. This pressure will certainly have helped.
I mean, Russia's economy has so far managed to surprise quite a lot of people. They've avoided a deep recession. But the indicators that I've seen, the latest indicators, not looking quite so good for the Russian economy, certainly on the growth side, in terms of consumer spending. I mean, could this really be Russia's Achilles heel?
Well, we perhaps underestimated the extent to which the Russians could keep their economy going. When they've devalued several times. They have managed to sell their oil and gas elsewhere, and they have managed to convert a lot of their industrial effort into a war machine. But they do have now very high inflation, they have very high interest rates, and any further squeeze on their ability to sell their oil and gas on the international market is going to hamper them. And you saw the recent agreement in Europe that there will be a further crackdown on Russia's shadow fleet, the way they have been getting out their oil, retankering it and selling it surreptitiously on the grey market. There will be a further clampdown on that. And you have this additional pressure from Washington as well. So slowly but surely, the Russian economy is being squeezed. And key to all this, of course, will be the reaction of China and India. They won't want their own economies to get caught up in any intense tariff embargo between the United States and Russia. So they too, I suspect, will be leaning on Moscow to come to some kind of accommodation. Now, this isn't going to be easy. Russia has declared its war aims, hasn't budged from them. It's not going to be easy. Ending wars isn't easy. But, I'm more hopeful now than I was a few months ago.
Yeah, I mean, you make a point there that I wanted to ask you about. I mean, has Russia made a single concession, and viewed from your perspective, during the course of these 6 months of attempts by the Trump administration to bring about a negotiated settlement?
No, they haven't moved from their original position. They certainly want control of all the areas that they currently hold. They want to have a kind of veto on any government that's formed in Kyiv. And above all, they want to completely dismantle, not just stop Ukraine joining NATO, but they want to dismantle NATO's military. None of that is ever going to be acceptable, because it simply means that Russia could come back for a third time, a third invasion in a few years' time, in 5 years' time, in 10 years' time. So, you know, we're pretty determined now in the West that we've got to have a settlement that is lasting, and that's why we've been working this side of the Atlantic on a reassurance force that would go in there as soon as there is any kind of ceasefire and make sure that that any settlement that's being agreed can actually last, and that as far as possible, any borders that are finally agreed in any final agreement are there and properly protected.
I mean, it looks like Ukraine, Europe, NATO allies have done everything that President Trump has asked of them these last 6 months, and Moscow has done none of them. I mean, is that basically why you think President Trump has, you know, had a bit of an about turn on this war?
Well, he's asked Europe to do two things. I mean, firstly, to increase its defence spending, and he's winning. You know, almost all the European countries are now quite dramatically increasing their budgets, even at the cost of some of the public policy and welfare programs that they would otherwise have spent the money on. There's been a massive increase in defence spending, for example, in Germany, which really will, you know, alter the kind of military power balance in Europe. So Europe has responded to Trump. And his second point, Europe has started to take more responsibility for the problem and not simply left it to a high-powered discussion between Moscow and Washington. Europe is now ready to put a reassurance force in there, is now deploying the interest on Russian assets, not yet the assets themselves, but is now using some of the interest on those assets in frozen Western accounts to help Ukraine, and is now spending quite a lot of money in purchasing and sending Ukraine the weapons that it needs. So, you know, there's an alignment now. I think Washington and London and Paris and Berlin are increasingly now, you know, on the same page, and slowly but surely cranking up the pressure on Russia. Now, you know, we may be wrong. We've been optimistic about a settlement before, but there is much more agreement, you know, across the Western allies as to how this settlement has to be brought into being.
Yeah, and just lastly, I mean, just to really sort of summarize everything you've just been saying, I mean, having Ukraine's allies singing from the same song sheet looks and sounds a lot more likely to yield results than having them saying and doing a whole lot of different things, which is where we were a few months ago. Would you say?
We were, and there was a lot of shock in Western capitals about the way Zelensky was treated on that visit to the Oval Office. But we're a long way beyond that now. There have been meetings and calls between Zelensky and President Trump, and you know, there have been many now meetings between Western leaders in London and Paris and in Washington. So we do have a coming together, and all of that, you know, it was necessary because it's the only way in the end to put pressure on Putin as the Russian leader to now have to face some realities and to either moderate his demands or now, for the first time, really feel the international heat, real pressure on his economy, and pressure that won't just involve the Western sanctions, but will involve increased sanctions from the West and quite possibly a disruption to the trade he's doing with countries like China and India as well.
Okay, well, thank you very much indeed for your time. Always a pleasure talking to you. Sir Michael Fallon, former UK Defence Secretary. Thank you very much indeed. Well, let's head over now to the Ukrainian capital, Kyiv, and we can speak to Salomia Babrovska, who's a Ukrainian MP and deputy head of Ukraine's delegation to NATO. Thank you very much indeed for taking the time to speak to us. I mean, a lot's been happening in the last few days, and it seems like there's been quite a lot of changes of position from the Trump administration. We're 5 months on from the unfortunate Oval Office encounter between President Trump and President Zelensky. Does it feel now, as a Ukrainian, that America is back on side?
You know, first of all, greetings from Kyiv. The second one, you know, to be honest, it's we are very careful and even cautious, I would say, with the last narratives and messages and statements from Trump. First of all, yes, we are thankful and we are glad to hear about Patriots, because that's the only missiles that we can use to hit the air ballistic Russian missiles. That's the first point. And that's the only way how we can protect the sky and civilian cities and the capital as well from the Russian terroristic attacks. Because what they have been doing for the last couple of months with the combining the weapons to hit the different objects, even civilian, mostly civilian, especially in Kyiv. That's really made a change, I would say, in the civilian perception in Kyiv of Kyiv people. That's the first point. The second one, it looks very suspicious and strange with the 50 days of giving time to Putin to stop his aggression. Because, at the beginning of July, that was July the 3rd, and they had a conversation between Putin and Trump. Putin said, I need, 60 days to get to the administrative borders of at least 2 regions of Ukraine. And now it seems and Trump said, no, I give you only 50 days. And it looks very strange. And that's why we are careful with the statements and with turning the position of US towards Ukraine.
Okay, so this ultimatum of President Trump, peace within 50 days, or else there'll be tougher sanctions. And you're saying you find this strange. I mean, do you think this is going to have any impact, this threat?
Because, 50 days is too much. Putin did almost everything he could except the tactic nuclear weapon. He didn't use this against Ukraine. He did everything. And just to give 50 days for what? To attack until the September Kyiv, or to get to the administrative borders of the regions of Ukraine, to occupy 2 more regions, 100%. 50 days for what? That's the big question for Ukrainians, and that's why we are not so optimistic, because these things can happen so much and so many in different, starting from the front line and finishing, and even with the negotiations, and probably US will push us to start negotiations with Russians. But the Russians now are stronger, not only on the front line, but with their position even when we, in terms of Russia-US relations, and that's why, are you serious with the putting peace and bringing peace back in between Russia and Ukraine? That's why we are so careful with that.
So you're saying that those 50 days look and sound a bit like a gift to the Russians?
Absolutely. They feel very strong and very aggressive on the front. They have on at least 3 directions the offensive operations, and in 50 days they can find the results. The point is whether Ukrainians, how we will stand, and when we will get the ammunition and Patriots as well to have a possibility, to defend ourselves.
Lots of telephone conversations have taken place between President Trump and President Putin. There have been visits to Russia by the US envoy Steve Witkoff. I mean, from a Ukrainian point of view, has anything been achieved?
It's now hard to say. I would say so many discussions and deals were made behind the curtain. But at least we have 2 silent nights when Witkoff came to Kyiv, and at least we could sleep. That's, I would say, even an achievement for the ordinary, average Ukrainian.
Russia controls about 1/5 of Ukrainian territory. Do correct me if I'm wrong. They're advancing, but very, very slowly, is what we're being told. Again, do let me know if you have more information for us. One person in the Kremlin is quoted as saying that appetite comes with eating. And I think what they're trying to say there is, why would they stop? If they're making gains, why would they stop? And what's your answer to that? From a Russian perspective, what's the incentive to stop if they're advancing?
there is no sense to stop for them. That's why we are so worrying about this 50 artificial days, and that's why all the steps we now accept as the part of the imitation, but not really the willing to stop the war, Russian-Ukrainian war. In order to understand Russia on the front line, you have to understand their mentality and the historical roots between of this war between Russia and Ukraine. Russia could never be again the empire without the heart. That's a Ukrainian heart. That's a Kyiv, and that's their strategic goal to occupy capital as well. At least, and to go to the Dnipro River, which is dividing Ukraine into shores, in two parts. And I want to say that actually, to be honest, we have the combat actions on the new region, that is Dnipropetrovsk region, which is behind the Donetsk and Zaporizhia region. And now we have them, at least in two places, the combat region. That means they will push and go to get their buffer zone, and they won't stop again. That's why we are worrying, and that shows that Russia, it seems to us from the both terms and sides, frontline and diplomatic, this war seems endless, because on the one hand, on the front, yes, they are slow, but they have success. They don't feel the lack of people. That's the problem with which we are facing, actually, to be honest, and what we have. And from the other way, they are now back with their diplomatic success, starting from the negotiations with the US, and they are quite, I would say, successful in psyops, in the media, in all this propaganda which is going through Europe, starting from the Hungary, Slovakia, and so on and so on. You know, that's quite strange position they got for the last 4 years.
How does that affect morale in Ukraine to think that the propaganda war, as you call it, is being as successful as it is in the countries that you mentioned?
You know, yes, we are exhausted. Yes, there is the feeling of being very desperate in a very desperate situation from the one side. But from the other one, we don't have the other Ukraine, and we don't want to be refugees. So there is no other way than except to stay, than to stay and to fight. That's the point of people who are staying here and continue to somehow to live, to fight, to build business. To feel more or less normal life somewhere in the regions where they can get this normal life. But yes, we are exhausted. But at the same time, we understand that's the last chance, you know, to hold the position and Ukraine on political map.
Just lastly, I mean, do you think President Trump has any leverage over President Putin?
I think he has real empathy, and this moment that when you're charming by this Russian soul of being very strong, ambitious, and building empire, when you are one of the strongest state. But understanding that it's the part of Chinese policy, but this looks like that this connection and these links, unfortunately, are stronger than we can imagine, and we are talking about.
Okay, well, we're going to have to leave it there. We're out of time, but thank you very much indeed for speaking to us, Salomia Babrovska.
Thank you.
Thank you for your time. Well, that's all we have time for on Global News today. Thank you very much indeed for watching. Be sure to join us again tomorrow for more exclusive interviews. Until then, bye-bye.